Hi, I'm Uri Zaki. I'm a political thinker, and this is 18 Questions for 40 Israeli Thinkers by 1840.
So we'll begin where we always do. As an Israeli and as a Jew, how are you feeling at this moment in Israeli history?
Well, on the one hand, of course, I feel devastated. My country has encountered its worst crises and since its creation. Hundreds of Israelis were killed. Where, as we speak, there's an ongoing war uh, in 7 different fronts, and you add that to a broken Israeli society. Um, so it's a moment of crisis. On the other hand, it might become a defining moment if the Israeli society and the Jewish people would know how to use this moment to reborn.
What do you mean by a broken Israeli society?
Where, well, the political and cultural differences are boiling, are in a boiling point.
Different than before?
First of all, up to October 7th, it was the peak of this political and cultural divide. The worst thing is that it was orchestrated by the current Israeli government, the prime minister and his allies. I mean, I believe in such a diverse society, a significant part of the leader of Israel is to try and bring the people together, not to divide them. And there was an orchestrated attempt to basically spill gasoline on the fire of divide. I mean, and specifically the year before, the since the creation of this government. Of course, it's not something they invented. It's part
You're
of
referring to judicial reform.
the judicial reform and the rhetoric around it. We are in an ongoing crisis that peaked with the creation of this particular coalition and its initiatives, and I believe it was part of the lowering of our immune system that enabled October 7th. If you want, I can elaborate on even on a pure security level.
Yeah, I'm curious briefly what you mean by that.
Okay, so apart from the intelligence analysis that this is a moment where our different enemies, and this was published before October 7th. It was part of the news that the intelligence chiefs and the military chiefs and the different security apparatus chiefs would say, this society crisis in the society is our enemies are aware of, and they want to abuse it. Even the fact that the military was preoccupied with this, its chiefs, its all levels were occupied with this. It was kind of a constant noise, which was artificial. It's not something that has to be done right now in this manner. It was, and this took a lot of their energies from what they were supposed to do, which was to defend our country. Even Netanyahu's own concentration on what is important, you know. So I believe it was reckless, and again, it was obvious. People were speaking about it. It's not like we live now in, I don't know, Switzerland, and we can, now think how our democracy is supposed to operate. We're in a very specific part of the world, and we're not loved here, and we have many challenges around us, and you can't afford being so brutal because at the end of the day we're supposed to be together fighting this, and we see it now. I mean it's yeah.
What do you think has been Israel's greatest success and greatest mistake in the current war against Hamas?
Well, I'll start with a mistake. The mistake was October 7th itself. I mean,
So it's funny. A lot of times that'll be the initial thing people say. I'll clarify, specifically referring to the war itself, post October 7th, once the war itself or the military campaign actually begun.
so the military campaign, and in parentheses, I would say, as part of Netanyahu's constant, reluctant view when it comes to operating force, started kind of slow, and which dragged the war, eventually dragged the war, and it's still ongoing as we speak right now, at least over a year. But I think on a military level, the fact that Hamas basically is defeated militarily. Hezbollah, which was the biggest immediate threat in the last 2 decades, is highly damaged with its, strong leader and whatever the biggest enemies Israel ever had, Hassan Nasrallah, killed by Israel. Of course, also the Hamas leader, Sinwar, killed in battle with the Israeli soldiers. So in that sense, we have military success. We also have a direct conflict with Iran, which it might be frightening, but it also kind of uncovers the truth. Iran kind of manipulated its proxies, and kind of, I'm not part of this. It's their doing, but right now they kind of took off their mask, which is, I always think that the truth is better than playing charades. But
These are the successes you're saying?
this is part. Yeah, the military success is obvious. I mean, it took a while, but it's, where Hamas is no longer, at least for the foreseeable future, a military threat from Gaza. Hezbollah is beaten, far from the threat it was. The problem is, and this started again. This is a political and diplomatic problem. It derives from both the nature of the coalition of Mr. Netanyahu and his own beliefs, I believe. He still, I mean, in my view, what led to October 7th was Netanyahu's old reluctance to deal with the Palestinians, and specifically with the Palestinian Authority, with the Fatah, with the more moderate part of the Palestinians. Therefore, enforcing their rival, which was Hamas. There won't be, he calls it the ultimate victory. There won't be an ultimate victory against Hamas if it doesn't have an alternative. And right now, Netanyahu is doing whatever he can to prevent the alternative to emerge, and that's strategically dangerous.
You think that's the greatest mistake that Israel's doing right now in the
Yes, and of course, ending the war. I believe the war has to end in Gaza. I think we achieved. Gaza is pretty much destroyed. If you need, if someone would try to attack Israel again and see the devastation in Gaza, they'll think twice, I believe. Whether you support it or not, that's reality. Hamas, as I said, is beaten, but it can reemerge unless you give it an alternative, and the alternative has to come from a more modern. I'm not talking about
So why do you think the war?
peaceniks from the for the John Lennon and Yoko Ono do not live in Gaza, but there are two streams of thought within the Palestinian political arena. One is fundamental Islamist, pan-Islamist even, jihadist, which is Hamas, and the other one, a nationalist Palestinian one, with which you can deal.
So why do you think the war in Gaza is still continuing?
I believe. Listen, right now, I believe it's first Netanyahu's reluctance to have this alternative to Hamas, but unfortunately also his personal political interests. He kind of plays with his coalition partners, namely Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the so-called Zionist religious party. I'm saying so-called because it's part of the streams within the Israeli society, which I highly respect, which is called the Zionist religious community, but he called his party like that. And the racist Ben Gvir, the Jewish Power Party leader. Both of them strongly support Israeli settlement in Gaza. Netanyahu cannot say that because Israel is dependent on American and Western support. But on the other hand, he doesn't want to show that he's doing something against it because he might lose his coalition. So I believe that's the main reason. But listen, there's another partner here, or not partner, another player here, which is Hamas itself. You can't stop the war without releasing all the hostages, and it's not like you can end the war at any cost. But I think if we would have said, we are ready for a Palestinian alternative with strong support from the world, and specifically the Arab countries, which are part of the axis America is trying to build here, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, so on and so forth, with investment and so on, Hamas wouldn't have had a choice but to accept that. But we're not saying that. We're very passive. And you have to be proactive right now, especially because of the hostages.
So very briefly before we go on to our next question, I am also curious. One of the things that I think outside of Israel, and maybe even within Israel, has been surprising or very telling to a lot of people is that, for the most part, almost across the political spectrum, right, left, and center, the support for the war and against Hamas was very consistent. That, maybe there have been arguments about what is most strategic or what should be done at which point, but support for the war itself was pretty universal in Israeli society. Very briefly, I'm curious, when did you diverge? Because you've been outspoken, supportive of the war for a very long time, and now you're saying that the war in Gaza needs to end. When would you say that shifted for you, where you felt like, at this point, I don't think that it's in Israel's best interest to continue the campaign in Gaza?
One of my main concerns is the hostages. And, when 6 of them were murdered, it was a turning point. And on the other hand, the killing of Sinwar was another point. I believe, I'm not one of those who say, it doesn't matter. Israel already proved its superiority, militarily speaking, and so on. I think the killing of Sinwar was symbolic. It was important. And now, when he's gone, and he's the architect of, and together with Def, who was killed before, and this came also after the killing of Nasrallah. It kind of, we made our point. We can afford going backwards or to retreat. Again, not at all cost, but we need to state that we are ready for that, and especially because of the hostages, because we have 101 hostages, many of them alive. It's crazy.
How do you think Hamas views the outcome and aftermath of October 7th? Was it a success in their eyes?
Listen, these people, it's very hard for me to get into their minds because these are fanatics, psychopaths. Of course, Hamas is not, as all human beings, and even the most evil ones, they're not a unity. I'm pretty sure that some of them look at things differently than the others. But as a political, theological, ideological stream or sect, I think they see it as a success. First of all, they have to tell themselves it's a success because they dragged Gaza into devastation. They have to tell themselves, this is part of Allah's plan or whatever. But it doesn't matter. I mean, objectively speaking, they brought destruction to their own community. Again, these are people who don't care, who used hospitals and schools and kindergartens as shelters to their military operations. They also see, by the way, and I'm sure that that's a success for them too, that there are, students in Ivy League American universities who chant from the river to the sea, which is their cause. No two-state solution, no peace. Kind of adopting the Hamas line on Palestine, which is crazy. So yeah, they might see it as a success, but it's not. They brought devastation and destruction to their own people, and that's what matters.
What do you look for in deciding which Knesset party to vote for?
Listen, I'm a we're talking about thinkers.
Yeah.
I'm a political activist, and till recently, I was the chair of the Meretz executive. Meretz merged with Labor to form the Democrats. So I'm a member of this party. So
Yeah, it's a funny question to ask. I'm curious what things you're considering, not necessarily who you're voting for, which I'd probably bet my money where that would be, but which considerations you have
It's
in
a
your
good
mind when you're
question.
thinking about
It's a
that.
very good question, and especially now we're in kind of as I said before, a defining moment for Israel. It might also be a defining moment for each voter. I believe the elements in a post October 7th Israel, for me, should be on the one hand, strong security approach. I mean, I won't vote for a party that says, don't support a war just because it's a war. There are justified wars. This war is definitely one of them.
Are there any such parties in Israel that really
Yes,
are
Hadash, the Communist Party, for instance. Even part of the margins that I'm not sure how wide they are in Meretz itself. Meretz is no longer, it's part of a new party, but if now Meretz would have been in existence, I'm pretty sure that some of it would be on that line. I'm not there, as you see. On the other hand, a political or a stated willingness to go for an agreement with a Palestinian party that is interested, that is not Hamas, to go to agreements with the region, to understand that we need to compromise as part of our Zionist vision to maintain Israel as a democratic Jewish homeland. This combination, without blinking to the, saying, making it vague that these two elements are important. And of course, a liberal approach to how Israel should look like. I think right now the division in Israel is not necessarily right or left. It's what kind of Israel do you want? And I'm part of. I believe it's Zionist basic truth that the Jewish homeland has to be democratic, in the deep sense of the word, not just you go to vote. You go to vote in almost any country. Non-democracies, you go to vote too. But to have a real democracy with checks and balances and all that involves. So these are the three elements, I would say.
Which is more important for Israel, Judaism or democracy?
Both. That's the Zionist formula. It's hard. It has some tension between those two elements.
And when the two come into conflict, which are you more inclined to preserve or fight for?
Again, I don't think they have. You have to decide between the both. If you have to decide between the both, it's a failure. I mean, I think they can coexist, perhaps with tensions, but it's, life is not formulas. I would not live, at least not in Israel, if it would not be a Jewish homeland or a national Jewish state. But I would not live in such a state if it would, for instance, say, we're no longer a democracy, or we adopt the halachic approach as our constitution, something like that. Although I'm what do we call a traditional Jew? I practice some of the halachic rules, but it can't be the constitution of this country. Or we would say, non-Jews have less rights. Even the situation right now has to improve. We're not where we're supposed to be. We're not at the, I used to be the chair of the Herzl Center. We are not fulfilling the Herzlian vision in full. We're still far from it when it comes, for instance, to equality. But if we give it up, that means that this country is broken.
Should Israel treat its Jewish and non-Jewish citizens the same?
Definitely. I think the only place where you should have affirmative action is at our gateways, meaning the law of return. There were in the recent let's say 2 decades, people started saying, you don't need it anymore. Jews are no longer under threat. I believe the last year proved that even in the most safe haven, which is the United States or Canada, places like that, Jews are still regarded as Jews and not Americans or Canadians or so on and so forth. We still need this basic law of return. But when it comes to rights in this country, they have to be fully equal. And that's why, by the way, so you'll ask me why should the flag has a Jewish symbol in it, why the anthem has to have Jewish elements in it, so on and so forth. I believe symbols we should also think about how to have non-Jews relate to those symbols, but those symbols reflect a Jewish tradition because there's a majority of Jews here. That's why I'm fearful of annexation. Because if you annex a Palestinian majority, if you annex the Gaza Strip, if you take the Smotrich vision of annexing the Gaza Strip, he talks about expelling them from their country. I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think it's moral. But so let's say you're ruling a Palestinian majority, then this country has to follow the majority because it's a democracy. That's why the Zionist vision has to have borders where you have a Jewish majority, which is kind of the 67 borders with perhaps changes, and the Palestinian entity or state. In other words, the route to fulfill the Zionist vision is to have also a fulfillment of Palestinian self-identity.
You mentioned that you don't think it's succeeding in that regard in terms of its treatment, that Israel's succeeding in its treatment of its Jewish and non-Jewish citizens. What did you mean by that?
Um,
Or there's room to improve, maybe in your language.
yes, first of all, the discourse is very problematic, and discourse is important in the life of a nation. You see basically racist politicians and groups succeeding more than before, and you know, entering the Knesset and you know, bringing up racist notions. But it's not only that; it's also the Arab community in Israel. You know, when you look at data, it's not as successful as the Jewish one. It gets less resources, less education. You know, so in that sense, the investment in resources, the also there is some. I mean, for years I could say there are no laws that that hurt non-Jews in Israel, but now you have that the how do you call it,
Nation state law?
the nation state law, which is a stain on our constitution or constitution legislation, which I think has no room in our book of laws. But mostly it's not legislation; it's policy. Not only by this government. This government is more vocal and blunt about it. But throughout the existence of Israel, you had policies that hurt Israeli Palestinian citizens. There were some improvements in several years, but we still have a long way to go. I believe that we should come to a situation where, like Herzl wrote about, where the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel feel that this is their country. I mean, yes, it will be a Jewish country, but you know, you have minorities elsewhere in the world, and even in the Middle East, where you have minorities identifying with a nation state different from their own national identity, and also perhaps if there'll be a Palestinian self-determination, you know, in this land somewhere, regardless of its borders, it will also help to achieve that.
So one of the things that I think is very interesting, and I came in wanting to ask about this, is that in 2010 to 2013, 14, you were working with B'Tselem in the US. But B'Tselem, and people will hear in the introduction for the podcast, the intro, it's an Israeli human rights organization. And I believe 2019, 2020, they came out that they believe Israel's apartheid. It's a one-state reality. Palestinians don't have equal rights. Despite your criticism right now, that does not seem to be where you're at. I'm curious how, having worked at the human rights organization B'Tselem, where do you find yourself in relation to that, and where do you find yourself in terms of, I think, at least the deeper struggles that you may or may not have as someone who's part of the liberal Israeli left?
First of all, I strongly disagree with B'Tselem. B'Tselem underwent a change of leadership about just less than 10 years ago, and ever since it, in my view, drove away from its original purpose, which was to analyze human rights and to introduce to Israelis mostly the human rights ramifications of our military control over the West Bank and Gaza. That was the original purpose of.
But arguably they would say that they're still doing that when they really stopped. Meaning, for
No,
like
they
let's say
took
their
it.
apartheid determination, they had a few 100-page report that, you know, they
That's a
with the
political
documentation.
statement. It's not. I mean, they you know, and it also involved a kind of going to the the UN Security Council and things that were very political. I think part of the strength of B'Tselem used to be its non-political, almost scientific analysis of the situation, and they adopted a very radical political discourse, which I think fails their task.
But aside from the strategy and the discourse, is there an on the ground reality that you view differently than B'Tselem does, having worked with the organization, having worked with different political organizations in the Israeli left, that you feel like either is like the core disagreement, so to speak,
Of
that you
course,
might have?
I think again, I think they are part now of what emerged, especially after October 7th. It existed there before, a kind of strong I would even say hatred towards the mere idea of Israel here. Unfortunately, it also comes from a very, 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 very thin margin here in Israel. But the mere notion of a Jewish nation state here in the land of Israel, Palestine, whatever your point of view is, mine is the land of Israel. You saw that emerging before and blasting after October 7th. I strongly disagree with. I couldn't. Let's put it this way. I never would have. Now I'd be working for B'Tselem. No way. Mind you, when I never worked for B'Tselem in Israel. I
Representative in the United States.
Exactly. I was hired to create B'Tselem USA. By the way, I was hired because I was a Zionist, and this tells you a bit about how American approach to Israel changed. They hired me because they knew I was a very outspoken Zionist, because back then, this is 15 years ago, you could not start a conversation in the US without strong support to Israel. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, now there are wider and wider circles where you have to condemn Israel to start a conversation on Israel. So in my B'Tselem USA office, you had the Israeli flag, you even had blue and white candies. I marched, by the way, with Peter Beinart, who since also changed his politics.
Yeah, he had a shift that was aligned, I think, with B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, and a lot of that happening in the,
right.
It's like the same few months.
But I marched with him in the Israel Day Parade, holding an Israeli flag and with a B'Tselem T-shirt.
When was this?
This is 2012.
Oh, it's a different world. Wow.
Yes, so I didn't change. They changed.
So what I am curious about, and then we'll move on to a different question, is in a 2020 interview on the Nice Jewish Boys podcast, you were speaking about how theoretically, it was about annexation. And you were saying theoretically, if Israel were to annex the West Bank, Yudav Shomron, and not give total rights and citizenship to all the Palestinians who were there, which obviously poses a demographic issue for Israel in terms of goals for a Jewish state, then it would be apartheid. And the crux of what B'Tselem at least seems to say in terms of the apartheid argument is that maybe they haven't annexed it, but it's a one-state reality. And so I'm just struggling to see how far the distance is between meaning it seems like the real disagreement that you're having with B'Tselem is one about whether or not it's a one-state reality, not whether or not the West Bank, Yudav Shomron is or is not part of Israel, because the core of it underlying of whether it is or is not, it seems like after that most conclusions would be quite similar.
Again, I think before we go to the specifics, the premise is different. When reading B'Tselem's statements and reports now, it seems to me they don't believe with the fundamental need, or not need, even reality of a Jewish national democratic state. It seems to me that they're against this. It's kind of comes out of there. So we don't like. I will say it differently, that the mere fact that Israel is a Jewish homeland, self-stated Jewish homeland, is a problem. Is kind of a part of its apartheid. I do not. This goes to the core of my beliefs. Again, I would not live here unless it would be a Jewish national state or a democracy. So I think there are things that have to be fixed, but that the core is good, and I feel that they think that things have to dramatically change. That the fundamentals have to change. If you want to talk about it philosophically, they have kind of a very black and white approach where Israel is the villain and the Palestinians are the victims, and I do not see the division like that. I don't think we're the good guys and they're the bad guys either. I think it's a complex situation, and once you lose the complexity, and in B'Tselem's case, I think they're objectively speaking, their only advantage on Human Rights Watch, all the other human rights organizations, is their Israeli identity. But once
But you group them essentially the same in terms of their credibility.
I mean, they gave up on the Israeli public altogether. So it's something that some of my when I debate with some of those radical leftists from the U.S., they tell me, "Oh, but B'Tselem said that, and they're Israeli." They don't represent anyone. They do not even represent. Yes, they're Israeli citizens, but that's how it comes up to that, and that's it. So I think it's they lost their kind of justification.
What role should the Israeli government have in religious matters?
In
religious matters?
I believe that Israel should have a separation between state and religion. I could have said church, but church is irrelevant here, but also churches. I believe it's Chilul Hashem, combining a secular structure like a state with a spiritual structure, which is the religion. You can never, unless, I don't even know what the model is for a religious state. You have so many different streams within the Jewish people or Jewish religion that if you're Orthodox, you're sure that you're the seal keeper, but then within Orthodoxy you have Haredim who are sure that they are the real seal keeper, and the Mizrochniks, like the modern Orthodox are wrong, and you can't have that. What does it mean to keep Shabbat or not? You see in Israel that the examples where you have respect for religious traditions are those which are not coerced by law. For example, bris, not driving on Yom Kippur. But when it comes to coercion, for instance, weddings, I haven't looked at it for a while, but at least for a very long while, the number of weddings, the ultimate number of weddings in Israel, through, in Israel only, you can only marry through the Rebbeite, the halachic way, was the exact one in the 2000s like it was in the 70s. But our population doubled itself. So that means that fewer and fewer people are actually getting married in Israel because they don't want the rabbis to be part of it. I'm pretty sure that if it would not be coerced by law, more people would marry that way. That's why I'm saying it's Chilul Hashem. And also, you see people who hate Judaism because of that. For instance, I have some family members, unfortunately, who told me for the first time I'm going to eat chametz this last Passover, not this one, the one before the war, because of all this chametz legislation that was talked about.
Mm-hmm.
This is crazy, and it doesn't have to be like that. I mean, if you again, you should have the Jewish calendar as an official calendar. You should have Jewish symbols. Hebrew, of course, spoken here. You have enough. By the way, there are fields where you can increase the exposure to Judaism. For instance, myself, as a graduate of a general Israeli school system, I never opened a Talmud page. This is part of the Ben Gurion approach that everything that was done after the exile is irrelevant. We should go back to the exilic period, but we should have that. A Jewish student or a Jew who graduated from high school in Israel should know what we have an amazing tradition here, and basically Judaism is Gemara. It's not the Old Testament. I mean, that's Judaism. So things like that. You could even have compromise on what it means. I mean, it's crazy not to have 24/7 public transport in Israel. You can't afford a modern country in the 21st century not having public transport with 10 million people living here, expected 15 million people to be living here in a few decades. You can't have that. You can have compromises that go with the halacha. For example, having a non-Jewish owned company running the weekend public transport, including the trains. But we can't go on with this.
Yeah, there needs to be some.
Yes.
Now that Israel already exists, what's the purpose of Zionism?
First of all, to have Israel as a safe haven for all Jews. And again, if somebody would have probably thought that this is no longer relevant, I believe in the post October 7th world, we see how important it is. And second is to fulfill what I see are the kind of general principles of Zionism. Having a democracy here, again, a Jewish state, but a full democracy. And this is a line that brings together Herzl, Ben Gurion, Jabotinsky, Begin, Rabin, you name it. To work on Tikkun Olam and not only be a great nation for its people, but also for other nations. In our first 75 years of existence, unfortunately we had to be self-centered, but the vision was that from here you'll have a kind of like a Peace Corps that you have in the United States. This is something that a successful Zionist vision should have produced here too. Using our knowledge and we do that, but it's not a national task right now because we have to defend ourselves. I think this is part of what it means to be Zionist these days. I mean, if I'm sorry, the how would I say it? Visionist will of Herzl. He had a very famous sentence. He said, "Treat the other," and he meant Arabs, the minority, or you'll be judged by how you will be treating the minorities in your future state. So if that's Herzl's will, this is also part of being Zionist.
Is opposing Zionism inherently anti-Semitic?
Um, Academically speaking, no, you could say, but in reality, I increasingly think it is, because you see the hatred towards Jews, you know, who are called Zionists. They don't even know if they're Zionist or not, but knowing they're Jews, they're um, accused of the word they use is Zionist. It's kind of like not using the N word, but using some other word, but means the same. So um, and to say that the Jewish people, you could argue before the establishment of the state of Israel whether Jews are entitled to have self-determination or not. To say now that you oppose Zionism and to chant from the river to the sea, meaning what these Jews are supposed to do, be killed or expelled, or live under a Hamas regime. What these people? So I think, in practice, whether philosophically or not, it's you can have the debate philosophically speaking. In practice, people who are against Zionism in its original form, if Zionism is Ben Gvir, no, but Zionism is not Ben Gvir. People know that. Zionism is a self determination movement from the 19th century that brought about the state of Israel. If you're against the mere, not only the mere idea, but you want to change the reality that was created in the last 100 years, where you have a country that is, you have 10 million people here. I think you can fairly say it's a form of anti-Semitism.
Is the IDF the world's most moral army?
I don't think armies. I'd never read of a rating of moral armies or non-moral armies. I don't think it's necessarily more moral than. Listen, there are probably militaries that do not even fight, so they don't encounter. Maybe the Swiss Army, they have a great knife, by the way. Maybe it's more moral because it doesn't have to deal with moral issues. Armies are not meant to be moral. There are definitely cases, especially due to the ongoing military occupation of a vast area and population. I mean, to me, and part of the reason I changed my political affiliation from right, where I was when I was a teenager, to left was my military service. I believe that the biggest moral problem is the fact that we militarily control Judea and Samaria's Palestinians, the West Bank Palestinians. And a military can't have its main task in controlling a huge civilian population. That brings about moral issues. And something that, like many things in Israel, that was supposed to be temporary became a regime. Mm. And that's morally wrong. It doesn't mean that the IDF in the rating of moral armies in the world is more moral. It doesn't matter to me. I mean, war is ugly. War is violent. You should do a lot to avoid war. But once war occurs, there'll be death and injuries and destruction. It's not nice. But sometimes it's a must. This last war was a must, where, and you started by one of your former questions, you said most Israelis, like a huge majority, supports or supported this war, or supports this war. Because we're fighting for our lives. We saw what happens when our military is down. We're butchered and raped and kidnapped. So, we're defending our home. But the biggest problem is the ongoing occupation, the regime of occupation.
To touch back on the question of the West Bank, so we actually had a listener who reached out and he emailed and he said, if you have a thinker, you think it's a good question, maybe pose it to them. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Again, I think that one of the things that is interesting to me and that I kind of keep coming back to is Zionist left and what that means in an Israeli context. Given the moral issues that you're seeing in the West Bank with Israel's presence there, with military rule, occupation of the West Bank, as you're saying, how do you hold? How does that form your view of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state? Meaning, how are you understanding those moral issues, and how are they in some way contained for you, as opposed to defining your overall view of Israel?
They're eclipsing the longer we are the military occupation, which is now a regime in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, continues.
What's the distinction you're making between why do you seems like you're recognizing development that you used to call it an occupation and now you're calling it a regime? What do you mean by that?
Because I think that the laws of occupation, which the jurists of the IDF in '67 smartly used, the Geneva Convention number 4, the Fourth Geneva Convention, so on and so forth, although they are not time defined, they never thought somebody would use them for over 50 years. They thought about Europe in the post Second World War, something like that, when American allies forces held Germany and things like that. Maybe something similar to Iraq or Afghanistan, temporary situation. The combination, by the way, of the abuse of Oslo, which was again an interim 5-year agreement, and the laws of occupation into one regime with areas A and B and C and all that, are all part of a regime of control of the territory and the people. And that's increasingly eclipsing our this almost holy combination of Jewish and democratic in the Zionist formula. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm talking about a regime. It's not, especially under Netanyahu, even the stated obligation to reach a different final status faded away, and it's very problematic.
If you were making the case for Israel, where would you begin?
Now I would start with the need, which I haven't done in years. The need. Jews are, we deserve self-determination, and look at this. We have we achieved amazing, almost a man-made miracle, where you have a flourishing country with, of course, the high tech, the startup nation, but also agriculture and universities and academia and schools and culture and the Hebrew language. It's unprecedented what we achieved here in so few years. So that would be my case for Israel. We have problems. Most countries have problems. Most democracies are undergoing crises right now. Our unique situation is our location. It couldn't have happened elsewhere, but it's tough. But even there, we're making progress with the acceptance of our neighborhood of us newcomers. newcomers, of course, in. Um, but we need to do something with the Palestinians that would fulfill the establishment of the state of Israel. We're still the fact that we didn't end this conflict with the Palestinians. I'm not talking about ending the conflict between the peoples. I don't know whether it's gonna, but to officially have an agreement with the Palestinians or a different reality with the Palestinians is kind of overshadowing our Israel is not full in that sense.
What do you think? Oh, sorry. Can questioning the actions of Israel's government and army, even in the context of this war, be a valid form of love and patriotism?
Can you elaborate?
Yeah. Can questioning the actions of the Israeli
questioning
government,
the
questioning
action.
the actions of the Israeli government and army, even in this war or in general, can doing that be considered a valid form of love and patriotism?
Of course. I think part of being patriot is not being a robot accepting everything whether it's in Israel or anywhere else in the world. I think a Russian patriot should question the aggressive, violent attack on its neighbor, the Ukraine, would be an act of Russian patriotism, rather than supporting a crazy invasion by their leader. Of course, questioning your leadership's actions is the truest form of patriotism. But you should not be dogmatic, both in support or criticism.
What do you think is the most legitimate criticism that's leveled against Israel today?
I think our ongoing occupation of the West Bank, and also the Gaza, not occupying it, but what we did there was also mistaken. But our
What we did there and what?
there was the siege on Gaza.
You're saying pre-October 7th.
Pre-October 7th, yeah. It was a siege only on the population, not on Hamas. They got everything they wanted in suitcases full of millions of dollars. But yeah, I think the criticism against Israel, and especially with this prime minister, especially with this government, not wanting to change the situation vis-a-vis the Palestinians, is legitimate. I don't see our leadership, and I think that's anti-patriotic. I think it puts Israel in a not because of security. We know how to defend ourselves, as you see, but in our moral core, our mere, as I said, the formula works on those two pillars. That's the structure of Zionism: the Jewish self-determination and democracy. And at one point, democracy is eroding. Not both. By the way, it's not surprising. Yeshayahu Leibovich, the great thinker here in Israel, said that once you occupy people, it would end up eroding your own democracy, and we see that happening too. So that's a legitimate criticism. But when it goes to one thing is to criticize the occupation, to chant from the river to the sea, and saying Israel itself is the problem. That's anti-Semitism, hatred, and should be condemned in all means possible.
Do you think peace between Israelis and Palestinians will happen within your lifetime?
Yes. Yes, I believe. I believe.
What do you think it will look like, and how do you think that it'll happen?
I think.
Thank you so much for answering our 18 questions.
By the way, not even closer than you think. I think it will happen in the next few years.
Oh, really?
Yes, I think. Unfortunately, the historical pattern shows that political change in the Israeli-Arab conflict, and specifically in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, come after a crisis. If you take,
But many would respond to that and say that if people look back, and this is like a narrative many people are familiar with, that pre 48 Israel offered this peace deal and that peace deal and this peace deal and that peace deal, and despite whichever wars were going on or whichever new developments happened, peace didn't occur, and the Israelis and Palestinians couldn't come to a consensus or an agreement about that. Why do you think that now would be different? And I think on top of that, I'm curious how, if at all, October 7th and what some people feel is almost the greatest validation that the mistake with Gaza was giving it up. How does that resonate with you? Or how do you think about that?
first of all, I think the biggest mistake was to giving it up unilaterally, not in an agreement. If you take Israeli history and its relations with its neighbors and the Arab world, whenever we had an agreement, it was fulfilled. Even the Oslo Accord that is so much truly so, as I said before, it now became a part of the regime in the which enables Israeli control over the West Bank. Even it, after now, it's fulfilled by the Palestinians. You have the security cooperation. So agreements do last. The agreement with the Egyptians, the Camp David Accords, they lasted through the killing of the president who signed them, Anwar Sadat, an Israeli invasion to an Arab capital of Beirut in '82, two Palestinian intifadas, and even the Muslim Brothers taking over Egypt. So that was Sharon's mistake. He wanted to avoid, like Netanyahu in a sense, he wanted to avoid touching the West Bank, so he separated them both by pulling out of Gaza and basically handing it over to Hamas. That was the mistake, not pulling out of Gaza. It was crazy to have such a small Jewish population with a vast Palestinian in the midst of a vast Palestinian population. That should have be part of an agreement. So what you're telling me is kind of like, we were good, they were bad. This kind of discourse, it doesn't interest me. Historically speaking, both sides sometimes need to undergo a crisis, understanding the limits of power in order to proceed to diplomacy and political agreements. And unfortunately, I couldn't imagine a more horrific disaster for Israel. But I think it will, again, also with the attention of the world, which kind of Netanyahu succeeded for years in kind of shelving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now it's, in the midst of all Western countries, including the United States. I don't think it will be shelved again in the foreseeable future.
But what I find interesting about that is that it doesn't seem like October 7th has drawn people closer in terms of, I think it's recognized there's a crisis, but it does seem as if it's pushed both right and left towards an acknowledgement that at the very least, what we had before we need to maintain. And at most, we need to, at the most extreme, push out the Palestinians. We need to de-radicalize whatever process that would happen there. And then it's convinced many proponents who were two-state solutioners or were in that camp that only a one-state reality, secular binational confederacy, whatever formulations people want. And I've heard you say in the past that two-state solution, you're a proponent of it, and I assume you're still a believer of it. The fact that model seems to be dying, I think, in the eyes of many. Do you agree with that assessment, and do you think that is telling at all about what the options for the future might be?
If you have a referendum on the Camp David Accord before it was signed, or on the Oslo Accord before it was signed, you will get a poor minority supporting it. Nowadays, what is it? almost 50 years later, it seems, what? Of course, it was the greatest thing to do. But back then, the chief of staff, Motagul, was sure Sadat's visit was a trick to bring over Egyptian commandos and kill the Israeli government. Again, I'm not saying that right now that's a direct result of a massacre. By the way, in both sides, the way they see it, will be a support of kumbaya and let's have peace. And I'm not even talking about a kumbaya and kind of peace. I'm talking about a diplomatic agreement. But I believe that's where we both should be heading, and I think we'll be heading there. I mean, we're now talking about less than a week before the American elections. I don't know who's going to be elected there, but even if you listen to Trump, he talks about peace. Yes, eventually you don't have many formulas to get there, and in a sense, for the Palestinians or for Israelis, if before it was clear that or a rephrase. Now, we always saw it that we are only the ones giving up. They're not giving up on anything. Perhaps now, when we see the support, even amongst our strongest allies, not in its leadership, but gradually also in its leadership, to the Palestinian cause, maybe we'll understand that they're compromising too. I'll say the following. I do not think that we can have right now a bilateral agreement without any, first of all, strong. In a future agreement, will the security element will have to be stronger than we thought a few years ago, even to an extent that the Israeli military would stay on the borders somehow, but we can't rely only on the goodwill of Palestinians. I think it will be part of a regional agreement. Israelis would, you even hear when you read the polls, what you said is correct. If you ask, you have a referendum or a public opinion poll, how many of you support a Palestinian state? It dropped from October 6th to October 7th to probably from 15% to 2.5%. I don't know. But if you'll ask, in a context of a regional agreement with Saudi Arabia and the moderate Arab countries, would you accept a Palestinian self-determination? You'll get perhaps even a majority. So it's also, and the Israeli public is smart. It's not just the candy you get. They understand that you need to in order to survive here and to flourish here, you need to be part of a wider circle. And the path to go there is also through de-escalation of our relationship with the Palestinians.
What do you think should happen with Gaza and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict after the war?
I increasingly think of a Gaza first kind of policy, that Gaza, in a sense, should be a test case for Palestinian self-determination, under the leadership of both the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and the region, with a large investment, by the way, also by Israel, a kind of a Marshall Plan. You have to, many times disaster is an opening for change. It happened in Germany, for instance, or in Japan, where the destruction was so vast, but those who caused the destruction, as a reaction to the aggression of both Germany and Japan, it was a justified destruction, but they understood smartly, the Truman administration back then, that in order to prevent that, you have to stop punishing the aggressors. that was one of the lessons of the Versailles Agreement, which was when the victors continued the revenge on Germany and its allies in the First World War. The Second World War attitude was much smarter, and I think we can do that. And Gaza is a perfect area to do that. But you have to have also a Palestinian run. You can't have it as an Israeli occupied territory. This is crazy. Yeah, nobody would accept that, and truly so. You have to have a Palestinian run region with, of course, with Israeli freedom of movement wherever you see a security threat, and a heavy investment by the world, by the Arab world, by even Israel, to reconstruct Gaza as a model. And I think it will have positive effect also on you can't have it. It has to come together. It can't serve the purpose of separating the West Bank from Gaza. The Palestinians see themselves, there are folks who say there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. On the other hand, I met not a few Palestinians, and recently not only Palestinians, Westerns, who say there's no such thing as a Jewish people in the sense of national identity. Nations are all invented. It's once you have enough people who feel that there are people, and the Palestinians are definitely a people in that sense, and you can't separate Gaza from the West Bank.
Is Israel properly handling the Iranian threat?
First of all, the results show that it doesn't. And again, the person who led us in the last 15 years or so is the person who, in his rhetorics, made the fight against Iran the number one issue, but under his, or within his term, too long term, Iran is in the verge of getting to a nuclear bomb and directly attacking Israel with missiles twice. Not by proxies, directly attacking. So we're definitely not handling it right. I believe it was a mistake by Israel to encourage the Trump administration to drop out of the nuclear agreement. I wish that now an American administration would understand that it's the world's interest to militarily end the Iranian nuclear program, or at least have an agreement that makes it impossible for them to get there. We can't afford having North Korea like Iran. North Korea is a huge failure by America, and specifically the Bush administration. And whoever will get a nuclear Iran on its shift, it's a major threat to world peace. Mind you, the Iranians are now part of the attack on the Ukraine. It has an axis with China and Russia. It has, of course, all its proxies, as we see now in the Middle East. It will be a different world if Iran has a nuclear program. So right now, it doesn't look very well, but there are opening of understanding, I think, around the world that we need to deal with this.
Where do you identify on Israel's political and religious spectrum? And do you have friends on the quote-unquote other side?
How do I identify myself?
Politically and religiously, and then do you have friends on the other side?
Politically, I'm on the Zionist left, I would say. Although I must say again, I believe this definition of right and left is not as important as it used to be. It's not the dividing. It's not the watershed in Israeli politics. I believe now it's, I don't know, authoritarian vis-a-vis democratic. When it comes to my own personal beliefs, I'm on the spectrum. I was born and raised in a secular community, but in slightly traditional Jewish home. I took it much further or farther. For example, I pray shacharit every morning with all the parts, but I do it on my own. I don't go to shul, but I do go to shul at least once a month, and of course on high holidays and different holidays. Maybe I should. The main thing is I'm a person of faith. I do not do that. I do not practice these parts of Judaism out of tradition, but rather out of faith.
And do you have friends on the other side?
I'm one of the, of course, I'm one of the most, the level of outreach I have with the different, by the way, all segments of the Israeli society, starting with Arabs, Druze, but also Haredis, National Orthodox, settlers. I'm one of the most, one of the only ones that regularly get invited to speak with such audiences and visit because of my kind of peculiar identity, being a kind of a symbol of the left, and on the other hand, with a strong Jewish, how would I call it, high profile, Jewish religious high profile, kind of, showcasing my Jewish, my Jewishness, I would say, my religious practices. So I talked in Haredi yeshivas, both Sephardic and Ashkenazi. I was the first, and I believe the only one who was invited to speak at the Mechinat Bnei David in Eli, the pre-military, I don't know how to call it, academy in Eli, which is one of the symbols of the National Orthodox community here in Israel. I had debates with, for instance, with Rabbi Shmuel Eliyahu, which, by the way, many times I get criticized by my own community or political affiliated community for doing that. But I believe that I make a difference. I come to listen, but also to talk, and I have the ability to talk. And I believe that people, for instance, with those students that invited me to speak at Eli, which is a settlement in Samaria in the West Bank, some of them still keep in touch with me, and this was like 10 years ago.
Wow.
So definitely, I keep constant touch with all segments of the Israel, and I visit regularly. I have friends, Arab friends, Druze friends. Yeah. Also myself, my father is Mizrahi. I have a Mizrahi last name, but my mother is Ashkenazi, and he made Aliyah from Egypt himself with his my late grandmother, and she was born here, a Sabra. So I have all these complexities within me. You kind of secular, religious, Mizrahi, Ashkenazi, and everything. So I guess I used to be a member of the Likud, and so I kind of my own persona is complex. So I think it's easier for me to reach out to other segments of our society.
And our last question, no, this isn't really. It's our beginning question. Do you have more hope or fear for Israel and the Jewish people?
I'm a hopeful person, so I always have more hope. So I believe Israel and the Jewish people would overcome these challenges. I think we already have gained great openings to change. But I could have made the case for fear. There are many things, many elements in the current Israeli society, especially from within, by the way, that can make you fearful. The choice is ours. We are in a juncture right now. I'll do my utmost to push us to the right direction, but it's not determined yet which course would take.
All right. Uri Zaki, thank you so much for answering our 18 questions. How was this for you?
It was great. Interesting.